If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what is your real-life terrifying, paranormal story? My grandparents lived in a farmhouse in rural Canada. It wasn't an old farmhouse at all, probably built in like the 1940s or 50s. It was a split level with unfinished basement with a large cast ironwood furnace. To allow heat to rise, there was a large cutout in the living room floor that was covered with a grate that you could see through into the basement. One day, my grandpa is sitting in the living room alone when he hears a loud crash from the basement. He heads down and finds that the heavy cast iron tools for the furnace had tipped over and were scattered all over the ground. These things probably weighed like 50 pounds total for the whole set and would have been hard to knock over without some force. When he was kneeling down to pick them up and put them back on their stand, he spots something under the furnace, a single white rose. We all had weird experiences in that house that ranged from cold spots to large floating green masses. There was a bedroom that none of the children wanted to sleep in because of just the vibe of the room, and the closet being specifically very unnerving. I'm pretty skeptical to paranormal happenings. I'm the person that if something falls in another room with no pets or people, then I'm thinking gravity did its work. I see things here and there around the house, but just flashes, and it just seems like my eyes playing tricks on me. There are two occasions that truly got me though. The first was a few years ago. We normally try to put our daughter in her bed, but during the night she often would come and jump in bed with us. We leave the hallway light on and the door cracked for her just in case. I woke up in the middle of the night and I'm facing the door and there is a small little face staring back at me. I'm closest to the door and my back is to the rest of the bed, but I could have sworn our daughter jumped in bed with us earlier. The face is gone by this point, but I'm staring hard at the door and haven't taken my eyes off it yet. I reach behind me and feel my daughter, then a little further and feel my wife. At this point I'm like shit. I get up and I'm creeping through the house looking for anyone and anything. Glancing around corners, but in the end I don't find anything. It was pretty vivid, but I chalk it up to me just waking up. The other time was just a month ago. I have worked pretty early, so I'm the first to bed. It was late and I tell everyone good night. We have a second daughter at this point. Our room/sleeping arrangement is that the bedroom door and bathroom are on the same side, are completely separated, and I sleep on that side of the bed. I tend to read for a bit before falling asleep. I leave the main light on because I'm not really feeling tired at all yet and just sit on my side of the bed to read, and our cat jumps up on the end and is walking up for some pets. I'm watching the cat when all of a sudden a head pops out of the bathroom door. It's gone in an instant. I can't remember any details either, so I'm thinking of just blowing it off, but then I remember that the cat's head moved to look at the bathroom at the same time I did. I was babysitting two younger cousins at their home, which was about 100 years old and situated next to a graveyard. There wasn't necessarily a bad feeling in the house whenever we were there, but it was a bit creepy at night looking out at the headstones. I was helping the girls brush their teeth and whatnot before bed, and I headed back downstairs after they were in their beds and I had said goodnight. I sat down and almost immediately I heard a commotion of doors, not slamming, but shutting hard, and the girls, I believe they were around 4 and 6, talking loudly. When I got upstairs, they were at the end of the hallway, around a corner, and they were pushing their hands against the door to the attic, as if trying to keep someone/something from coming through. "We gotta shut it. Help us shut it," they half shouted and half whispered. I'm already on edge because of the house, and the stories my aunt and uncle had shared with us regarding paranormal activity, and so when I put my hand up against the old, heavy attic door, I absolutely shat when I felt something pushing back from the other side. I paused for a moment in shock, then quickly and forcefully slammed it shut. Thank goodness. The girls thanked me, as if this were like a normal bedtime thing for them, and went back to their rooms to go to sleep. I noped the heck out back downstairs. My aunt and uncle returned later that evening and I mentioned it to my uncle as he drove me home. He just kinda chuckled and said something to the effect of, "Yeah, sounds about right." I spent my late childhood, early adulthood in this house situated in a nature reserve in Brazil. Several weird things happened here, and they're like a snake mysteriously showing up in my fully closed room, missing objects here and there, trees that seemed misplaced from one day to the next. But one thing kinda stands out. Now I should start off by saying I'm pretty cynical. I'm an atheist, and I don't really believe in paranormal stuff myself. I usually explain away all the crap that happened. Snake? Crack in the foundation of the house, likely got in like that. Objects missing? I probably lost them outside the house. Trees moving? I just misremembered where they were. That said, this was weird. This one night I was just staring up at the stars. A benefit of living in a nature reserve is the lack of public lighting, and my dog started barking. Now it was a new moon night, so it was particularly dark, so I couldn't see much. But the dogs really rarely barked unprompted. I got up from where I sat to go check on what they were barking at. To my mind, it was probably just one of the little creatures we sometimes got visits from: armadillos, mice, opossums. I was wrong. At the edge of the property I saw what looked like a deer. The kind I knew only from American horror movies with antlers and shit. That was already weird. To my knowledge, those don't really exist below the equator. But alright. I tell the dogs to shush, thinking something along the lines of, "Hey, it's just the plants, nothing to worry about." But the thing starts to move. It stands up, over the fence we had there. Mind you, the fence was like 2 meters tall, so this thing is massive. As soon as it was upright, it let out this bleat that sounded like a woman's scream. In the split second it did this, I just ran with the dogs inside the house and sheltered myself under the table. Never saw that thing again. Thank God. There's an urban legend somewhat near my house that was passed on through a generation or so about an old bridge. My friend and I went out there a couple times, and one night we got really ballsy and went out there and walked down the road. Super creepy road, thick woods, dilapidated houses. We walked past a house where a kid supposedly murdered his parents and went to the bridge and decided to keep going after not seeing anything. We get to this long driveway in a clearing with an old church-looking building. No cars, nothing in their yard. The grass was unkept. So naturally we started walking up the driveway, and I heard what sounded like a SKKKRRRSHSHHHHHH very loudly. Right in front of us. I froze in place to make sure what I was hearing wasn't a part of my imagination. I turn around and my 2 accomplices were already 100 yards away, sprinting away. We get back to my house and we ask what it could have been, and I said it sounded like a car peeling out in gravel. They agreed. That night I went online. Probably 2009-ish, and I found a website of local urban legends and hauntings. I was reading stories from years prior where someone wrote on there that he had went to a church past the bridge and heard what sounded like a car peeling out. Gave me the chills. I was in the woods, on vacation in Sweden. It was about 3 a.m., and I had to piss. We were out camping. Suddenly I hear footsteps. I start asking who's there? And I hear nothing, except for the footsteps coming toward me. I'm either a dumb asshole or the bravest dude ever, but I don't run away. Suddenly, when the footsteps seem to be right next to me, they stop. Suddenly, I feel something tugging on my leg. I actually fall down. By the way, this whole time, I'm still pissing. I feel something, some hair, some skin. On instinct, I aim my penis toward the thing, and piss, guns blazing, toward it. I hear a human scream, and just as quickly as it came I hear footsteps running away. I'm 90% sure it was a man. I was just 15 at the time. It was either a ghost or a ducking guy who tried to rape/kidnap me. Not my story, but my dad's. My dad was always scared of dogs when Elle was growing up, but he would never say why or tell me to ask my great-grandma. Once, when we were visiting family in the small Mexican village where he grew up, everyone started sharing ghost stories about things that had happened in town. I asked about why my dad was scared of dogs, and this is the story they said. One night when my dad was around 10, a dog had gotten into the house and awoke 2 of my dad's uncles. Stray dogs weren't uncommon, and the house had a courtyard/yard in the middle where a dog could potentially gain access. It was the middle of the night, and apparently the dog had glowing red eyes. Thinking it was potentially rabid, they killed it with a machete and left it in the kitchen to clean up in the morning. When they woke up the next morning, the dog was completely gone and there was no blood or sign of it. A few years go by, and one night my dad is taking the trash out to the back, and there is a large black dog with glowing red eyes on the roof across from him. It starts speaking to him telepathically, saying, "Come to me." My dad eventually bolts and runs back inside. My friend and I were walking alone at dusk, after a tour in a historic cemetery that had a grisly, bloody past and was notorious for poltergeist activity. While we were walking towards the back mausoleum for a quick thrill, giggling in conversation, we both stopped dead as we watch a freakishly tall black shadow person step out from behind a grave about 30 feet away. This thing was blacker than the color black itself. An empty void. We stood in silent awe as it creepily strolled forward until it finally ducked behind another large grave. We literally ran out of the graveyard in a confused state of bewilderment and barely spoke of the matter for 10 years. My friend was very skeptic and tried to explain away what we saw. She only told me recently that she genuinely believes it was something paranormal and thinks about it still to this day, as do I. From the time I was born until about 14 years old, I had night terrors consistently. When I was 2 years old, my family moved to a new home, and as soon as I started talking, I would tell my mom about my night terrors when she would wake me up from a screaming fit in the middle of the night. A majority of them were the same dream over and over, a man standing next to my bed with his dog at his side and both of them staring at me as they burn to death and the house becomes engulfed in flames. I never thought much of it, and those dreams started to be less common as I got older until I stopped having them altogether at 14. Coincidentally, at 14 my family moved into a new house. A few years into living at the new house my family was around the table eating and we began talking about some spooky stories from childhood and stuff. My brother then made a joke about me being able to see dead people and my mom got mad at him and told him to be quiet. I was confused as I never remember seeing any ghosts or apparitions. My parents ended up telling me the truth about the house we lived in, saying they didn't want to tell me when we were living there because I would get scared. Turns out, an elderly man and his dog burned to death in an electrical fire while sleeping, in my room specifically. I have a few, but I'll start with the first one that shook me up as a child. I always had an overactive imagination as children do. I was probably about 9 or 10 and I hadn't had a nightmare, hallucination, tricks of the mind, etc. for a few months. I had a bunk bed all to myself in my own room, so I would usually choose if I wanted to sleep the top or bottom bunk every night, and that night I decided to sleep up top. I was reading a book. It was a Star Wars encyclopedia. Actually it was about 3 a.m. I think, a little afterwards. My flashlight had died, so I put my book away and just kind of laid there in the darkness for about another 30 minutes, but ever since my flashlight had died something had felt off and it sounded like I was hearing a low humming, but I had weird sounds coming from my ears all the time, so I figured it was something like that. What happened next was so backwards. Ever since I was a child I could never sleep with my door open. It always had to be closed and locked, even though my mom used to beg me to keep it unlocked in case of a fire. I never listened. Anyway, the reason why it was backward is because I knew it was closed and locked, but I heard my door slam shut, and when I slowly looked at my door it was wide open. I was so confused, and I blinked and then there they were. Two small children whose looked like they consumed light. They were darker than the pitch black void of the empty hallway behind them. I was convinced I was just a trick of my mind. I slowly climbed down the ladder. And as I approached them I froze in my tracks, as if in that moment I knew they were real. It felt as if 4 or 5 seconds went by and then they vanished, and with them the darkness of the night did too. As light poured into my room I went to go look at my clock and it was 8 a.m. in that fast of what felt like seconds to me. Time skipped. I grew up in the oldest 2-story log cabin in our state, built roughly 200 years ago. It was built by a historical figure who started a very famous distillery. I love talking about the history of the home/land/distillery, but it's just too obvious and not good to share info like that on the internet. Anywho, we all experienced multiple different things in the farmhouse. Our living room was on the first floor and had the original log cabin walls. My bedroom was on the second floor directly above the living room, which also had the log cabin walls. The rest of the home was added on by various generations. At the time, it was my parents, 2 younger siblings and 2 older half-siblings that came on the weekends. We all experienced different things. The worst one was my older half-brother and my dad. They would both wake in the middle of the night, thinking the other was calling to him. They would always end up meeting on the stairs, asking the other what they wanted. It sounded like an urgent whisper calling their name. My brother became so scared at the time, he started peeing in the corner of his room at night because he was so scared to leave his room. My brother was 12 at the time, the most adventurous kid I knew. The story of the stairs according to locals is a girl died on the stairs not long after it was built, burned alive. The story goes it was Christmas Eve and she had snuck downstairs to look at her present. It was a new dress. She was twirling around in front of the fireplace when it caught on fire. She was so scared to tell her parents and admit to opening her present that she died on the stairs without telling anyone. Maybe she was on the way to get her parents upstairs, who knows? My mom and dad also experienced the urgent whisper at nighttime, believing it to be the other person. It seemed to happen in the evenings. One of them would be in the living room watching TV, the other in their bedroom, always meeting halfway to each other, at the foot of the stairs. My parents would open up the windows in the evenings, and all nice nights, they would hear faint old-fashioned music playing, and could never find a source. We lived on 100 acres, so we didn't have neighbors close by. I experienced a very strange haunting that to this day doesn't make any sense. When I was in my bed at night, the lights were off, I was by myself, I heard someone laughing. It went on and off for a couple of minutes, snickering, laughing, muffled laughing. Very terrifying. I was the only one upstairs. My 2 older half-siblings that I shared the upstairs with weren't home. My mom and dad lived downstairs in a different part of the house. I was 10 at the time, and my little siblings were 5 and 6, sound asleep. We were not a practical joke family. I laid there in bed awake all night, terrified to move a muscle, pretending like I wasn't there. When the sun came up I told my parents what had happened. They didn't believe me. They told me it was a bad dream, or that one of my toys, the batteries must have been going bad, so it made that funny noise. The next night I was back in my same bed and Dad was reading me LOTR. He would read a chapter the day before, then paraphrase it to make it more interesting to me. All of a sudden, the same laughter came back. It sounded like it was coming from the ceiling. I just remember laying in that bed being still and quiet while my dad and I stared at the ceiling. The next day, we go into the attic looking for a toy that was broken or any explanation. We never found one and it never happened again. We started referring to it as the laughing clown, as I hated clowns. Those are a few. Not mine, but a story from my mother and grandmother. They told me about how my younger brother had woken up in the middle of the night one time and had come downstairs to use the bathroom when he seen the figure of an older gentleman sitting in the corner of the room, right where my grandfather's favorite chair used to sit. He said the man turned to watch him as my brother walked past to go wake my mom up. The next day, my grandma sat down with him and my brother described the man, my grandfather, to a T, down to the oxygen tank he wore for the last few years of his life. I always chalked it up to the fact that my grandfather's ashes were kept on the dresser in the master bedroom. Also, for my own ghost story. When I was 16 I was a weird kid. Floated through the emo phase and spent a lot of time in cemeteries keeping the forgotten dead company. Well, there was this one grave that drew my attention. In the whole graveyard, the headstones were all situated in an either east or west facing orientation. This one grave was facing north, and was out of the row, maybe a few inches from the paved path, and there was a tree behind it. I had found myself drawn to that grave, even though I had never known this person. He died 100 years from when I found the grave, and was close to the same age as I was when he died. I found out later that he died of pneumonia, had been married, and had a few kids. I had an unnerving experience one night. It was around 11 p.m. and I felt almost as if I didn't have control of my body. I went to the other side of the river from the graveyard and managed to snap myself out of it before anything happened. But somehow I knew it was him. I never returned to his stone. Even to this day I've never stepped foot into that graveyard. There was this time I was stargazing in my grandma's backyard since it was very dark and I was taking a photo of Hercules star cluster. Very close by my grandma has a shed full of tools and other stuff. My parents, grandma, and aunties were all sitting in the house either asleep or talking in the living room. I started to get this strange feeling while I was looking into the stars, although I couldn't explain the feeling. It was more of a feeling of being nervous and scared at the same time. This would go on for like 15 minutes. During this time I was just doing my best to ignore it since it was starting to get onto my nerves. Then this loud crash came from a shed close by. I had turned towards the shed and caught a glimpse of someone or something running behind the shed on all fours, but the way it ran behind the shed felt extremely unnatural. Almost like it wasn't supposed to run like that. After seeing that I almost wanted to scream, but I built up my courage to just get my stuff and go back inside as fast as possible. It took like 5 minutes to get my stuff back inside, the whole time checking behind me each time I carried something back inside. I didn't tell anyone what had happened and for the rest of the night I couldn't sleep. This would screw with me for the rest of the time I had for clear skies since I didn't want to see what that thing was again, and I also didn't go anywhere near that shed for the rest of the time that trip. There's an old castle in woods near where I live with an underground hall and a creepy staircase that leads even further into the ground but turns a corner and abruptly stops. It is all the normal haunting history, built by demons and whatnot. Me and my mate cycled in and walked up to the castle. The entrance to the chamber is a very low narrow passage that you have to practically crawl through. We get into the chamber and look around for a couple minutes until we hear a high-pitched ringing. I have never sprinted out of somewhere as fast as I did that day, and I've been in a shooting incident. We both run back to the bikes and stand in shock for a few minutes wondering WTF we both just heard. It was far too deliberate for it to be the wind or anything like that. We then hear the noise again and realize there is a golf course nearby and it's the bell to say that you are off the green. Screw that golfer. So I moved to Louisiana not long ago. When I got down here I had my 2 best girlfriends come visit, help me unpack and such. Well, we go out to a bar one night and are bullshitting with this guy a bit older than us, definitely a regular at this place. He's telling us that the area we are in is known for having a lot of exorcisms happen. We are jaws to the floor shocked to hear that. Him from the north, so religion and stuff of that sort isn't as big as Louisiana. We go home, start researching the whole exorcisms thing, which leads us to talk about the Warrens. I'm from Monroe, Connecticut, where the Warrens are from. We planned to go thrift shopping the next day because I needed to decorate and on a budget. We drove by some antique stores that looked pretty funny if nothing else. Obviously we had spooky stuff on our mind and were making "oh this is definitely haunted" jokes when we'd pick something up. I got a few pictures to hang, a vase for some flowers, And a super cool old wooden baby bike thing. Definitely from around 1960s. It was wood, you'd sit the child in, had a place to rest something on the back, and a fake handlebar on the front. My son was the perfect age for it and I was like, oh cool, I'll take it home, sand it down and maybe paint it again. I take everything home, leave it all on the floor because I had no idea of where to put things away it yet. We go out to dinner and the bike is all the way across the room. It's a carpet living room. Even if the house was uneven, no ducking way would that happen. Still, we had spooky stuff in our heads just the night before and make jokes about it. But for weeks after it would roll to places I hadn't left it and by the logic in my mind, shouldn't be. I even started testing it because I was really going insane. I know baby bike rolling by itself isn't all that spooky, but it is when you're the one dealing with it. I just didn't get a good feeling about it. I'm not superstitious, I don't even know where my thoughts are on ghosts, but it really just was strange. I ended up having to get rid of it because the wood where his butt would go was just a little too unstable and frail to fix. Plus I didn't want it around anymore. I still don't know if I just had spooky stuff on my mind when I bought it and it first happened, so then every time it happened my mind went that way. But I think my tests were rather thorough and something in my gut tells me it wasn't normal. I was in a village in the Adirondacks, helping house sit for family members while they dealt with some medical emergencies. Now, I'd heard a few weird stories about this house from said family members, but always wrote it off as a mixture of superstition and it being an old house. Until this one winter night, I'm pretty sure I was watching South Park or something on Comedy Central, when I noticed that I was having trouble hearing the TV. I start looking for the remote when I hear what sounds like a young child bawling his eyes out walking down the street outside the house. Now remember, it's the dead of winter, no pun intended, at close to midnight, in a small village in the Adirondack Mountains. What the duck could a kid possibly be doing out there, crying like that? So I pause my search for the remote control and start going to the window to see what the duck is up. My hand is on the curtain, about to peek out, when a new sound joins the crying kid. It sounds like a pack of kids following the crying kid and they are laughing just, maliciously. Like, if every bully you ever had got together and followed jeering at you at your worst moment. This one kid is still just sobbing his poor ducking guts out and the rest think it's the funniest thing ever. I froze. As in every part of my lizard brain was screaming at me, don't do it, you will die. I basically stood there for a minute, so afraid to move a muscle until the sound finally faded into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. I've tried to reason to myself later on that it must have been some wild animals or something, but the weird thing with the TV and the fact that I'm not superstitious but my body entered into danger mode, always makes me wonder. When I was about 11 at summer camp, we went on an overnight camping trip in the woods. In the middle of the night, nature called, and I went outside. There, I saw an older teen, all of our counselors were either HS seniors or young college students, in a varsity jacket standing outside taking a smoke. I asked him where was a good place to go and he smiled at me. I turned away for a second and when I looked back, he was gone. The next morning I asked my counsel who the guy was and when I described him, flat top, varsity jacket, he turned white. He said that in the 50s, a bunch of local kids had gone into the woods and were murdered. I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me. Several years later, when the internet was a thing, I ended up remembering the incident one day and searching it out. Turns out my counselor was 100% correct, and the hairs on my body stood on end. Ever since then, I've been convinced there are such things as ghosts. Neighbor's daughter is 4. Has an invisible friend. Parents are told it's normal and to play along. Little girl sometimes brings her mom her friend's scarf to wash with the white laundry. Her hands are empty, but she's holding up the pretend scarf. Mom plays along, happens every other month for a few months. Girl can be found in her room talking to her friend. She calls him Charlie. Then the mom's father dies. They have tons of family and friends in town, decide to have a reception at their house. Mom goes into attic to get all the old pictures of her dad. Sets them up all around the house. During the party the little girl comes out of her room. As she's walking past a table she stops and says, "Mommy, why do you have a picture of Charlie?" Mom says, "Those pictures aren't Charlie, that's my dad." This particular table was full of pictures of her father during his time in the military. Little girl says, "No, that's Charlie," pointing to one specific photo at the back of the table. Mom picks up the picture and looks at the back. It's not her father. It's her grandfather. His middle name is Charles. And it's one of those pics where he's standing on the ladder of his fighter plane. Wearing a white scarf. Mom swears the box was buried in the attic, undisturbed, and that the little girl was never up there alone. There's no way she could have seen that pic. Was out camping with my brother on a squatching expedition, basically staying out late by the campfire and lighting up the woods around us intermittently with a spotlight to see if anything was around watching us. The area we camped in had multiple BFRO reported sightings, but no signs of Bigfoot. It was at the end of a logging road, very remote. What we did see is the only thing I have ever been unable to logically explain. Out of a bald circle of earth within our camp, a string of illuminated blue orbs rose up rapidly and then vanished. We both saw it and were left speechless. It was pretty cool, actually. I encountered a Wendigo when I was a kid. Little backstory, I live in New Mexico and live close to the mountains in my city. Skinwalker aren't common in New Mexico, they're a lot more common in Arizona or places that have reservations. New Mexico does have reservations but very few. One day my mom wanted to go up the mountains with the rest of my family, mom, dad, brother, and sister. P.S. My family had gotten in a really bad fight that morning. Few hours after getting on the mountain, I was in front of my family, when I suddenly hear my sister call my name in front of me. I was a little confused, but my 9-year-old mind, I choked it up to me falling behind. Before anyone says anything, I did look around and there was no one around me. I started to run to my sister when I realized that my sister's voice kept getting farther and farther. Then I heard my dad say that we're going home. I looked up the mountain and saw my family way up the mountain. I looked around so confused. I ran up the mountain to my family, and on the way back to my house my brother asked me, "Who were you talking to?" I asked him what he was talking about. Then he said, "You were talking to someone while speed walking down the mountain." When I was a kid, I would spend the night at my great-grandmother's house a lot. She lives in a small home at the base of the mountains and in the kind of area where your nearest neighbor is miles away. One night I was there alone because my great-grandmother had gone out to dinner with my grandmother, and my dad and brother were out at the family hunting camp. It's pitch dark in the house and I'm laying in bed trying to sleep, and I hear the front door open and my dad mumbling to my brother, but they aren't turning on any lights, which I found weird because I just knew my dad was drunk and would be stumbling around with the light on and falling over with how dark it was. A few moments later I hear someone, I'm assuming my brother, shuffle into the hallway that leads to the bedrooms. My door is open and I'm pretending to sleep because I don't want to be bothered, and I hear him shuffle into my room and stand by my bed and just breath. Doesn't say anything, and I'm starting to get creeped out. In my head I'm thinking him and my dad were in cahoots to try to scare me. So I'm laying there waiting for him to reach out and yell to jump scare me. It feels like forever and nothing, still standing there just breathing. I'm working up the courage to roll over and say something so he knows I'm awake and he isn't scaring me, even though I was genuinely scared from the anticipation, and I hear the front door open, the light from the kitchen flips on and I hear my dad and brother. The breathing stops, and I shoot up in bed and straight to the kitchen and tell them what just happened. I was around 9 to 10 years old over my grandparents' house. I would set up a mattress at the floor by their bed and sleep there. I woke up around midnight cause I felt the need to go to the bathroom. The moment I opened my eyes, it's there standing by my feet looking at me. It was some humanoid creature. Messy long hair, no shirt, big yellowy eyes, and a dirty torso. It also had a tail, I think. I swear it's a demon. I immediately covered my eyes with my hand. I tried to take a peek and guess what the duck I see. It was staring back at me, face mere inches away from mine. I shit you not, I started praying to God Lamau. I started asking him to forgive me for all the shit I've done and to just make it disappear. After a while I tried peeking again and it was gone. That's as far as I can remember. Tried telling my parents and they didn't believe me, of course. I used to play in a band that practiced 5 nights a week in rural Maine. One night, after practice, the owner of the farmhouse we practiced at went to his desktop computer in the practice room/barn and said, "Check this out." The farmhouse was built in the late 1800s and there was a small, family cemetery about 1/10 of a mile up a pathway leading into the woods. The owner, his girlfriend and his sister, on the previous night, had walked out there with a digital recorder. Ghost hunters and adventures were hugely popular at the time, in order to have an EVP session. He pressed play on a Windows media player file and I heard them asking questions. "Is anyone here with us? And what's your name?" Then there was a horrifying screaming sound that was completely inhuman, followed by a short growl and the words, "Go away." I was definitely freaked out and intrigued. Shortly after, I stepped outside to shake the dew of my lily. We peed outside as to not constantly walk in and out of the main house. It was always super dark, no street lights, and only one motion sensor light in front of the house for the main drive. I stepped around the side of the barn and started my business when I suddenly felt really cold. This was summer in Maine, high 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and I didn't feel alone. I looked up and up, and up. In front of me was what had to be a 7-foot tall, pitch black apparition. It had no facial features and it was wearing a black, almost cowboy style, hat. I tried to back up and fell on my ass, still pissing. By the time I hit the ground and looked up again, this thing was gone. No sound. I ran back into the barn yelling for Smitty, the owner of the farmhouse that showed me the EVP, and started to explain what had just happened, but he stopped me. He said, "Let me guess, giant male, like 6.5, 7 feet tall with a cowboy hat and all black like a shadow?" Yup. He had seen him on more than one occasion on the home's second floor. So had his grandmother and mother when they visited. His daughter, Tenyo, had also seen him around the property from time to time. I quit the band about 3 weeks later. I can only imagine the evidence they may have now, since this was almost 10 years ago now. When I was in high school, I was coming back from the movies with a group of friends. We had the radio on and everyone was talking except me. I was in the back seat looking out across the fields along the road. This particular stretch of road was known by everyone to be haunted. There was a ghost car that you never saw out your front or rear windows, you only saw it as it came past you on the side. It was all black and never had its lights on. It was a 60s Corvette. Or it was brand new Corvette. Or it was a Trans Am. Or it was a pickup truck. Everybody who claimed to have seen it seemed to see a different vehicle, but always black and always with no lights. I never saw it myself. I'm just mentioning it for context. What I saw that night was a light way off in the distance, a couple hundred yards, moving across the field and keeping pace with the car. I looked away from the window to check the speedometer. We were going about 50 miles per hour. I looked back and the object was now at least 100 yards closer than it had been. It was a person. They were running. I couldn't tell much else though because they were luminescent. The light wasn't reflected on them. It was coming from them. I turned away again and was about to ask the others in the car if they saw what I saw, but they were in a heavy debate about something, so I left it and looked back out the window. It was closer still. Less than 100 yards away and still running. I looked away and then looked back to see if it moved again. It had. It was half the distance closer from where it had just been. It was still difficult to make out details because of the glow, but it was definitely a man. He was running and looking forward. I did the look away thing again. And he was even closer. Less than 20 yards. And, without breaking stride, he turned his head and looked at me. I couldn't make out his features very well, but I could definitely see his eyes, and they were fixed on me. He kept running, but he was only looking at me. Just at that moment, we turned off the highway and onto a dirt road that led to my house. I didn't tell anybody what I saw. I just said good night and went up to bed. That night I dreamed about the car ride and the glowing runner exactly as it had happened, except that in my dream, we didn't get off the highway, and the runner got closer each time I looked away until he was about a foot away from the car window, always looking right at me and running at the same speed as the car. And then he stopped moving his arms. His legs were still going full tilt, but he had crossed his arms. I still couldn't make out his features, and at that distance, the glow was actually hurting my eyes a little. And then he uncrossed his arms and put one finger up to his lips, signaling me to keep quiet. And then I woke up. And I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At one of my previous sysadmin jobs, we were closing down one of our smaller data centers as it was being consolidated into one of our larger ones, but we still had to have at least one person there in case of server issues that had to be dealt with on site. We rotated each week on which one of us would do the overnights there. The place was reportedly haunted, by what I have no idea, just heard rumors from other coworkers when I hired in. So imagine a relatively large open office space that is completely void of all the cubicles, desks, etc. that are normally there, with just one desk and a few random cables hanging from the ceiling. Also, just the lights over my desk were working and bleeding out into my surroundings by about 3 feet. That was where I was for the week lol. I remember sitting there and just hearing ambient noise from the sort of far off server room, fans, cooling system, etc., working on a server for a customer of ours and seeing something dart across the room in my peripheral vision. I looked up and didn't see anything, so figured my eyes were just tired from the screen light and making me see like those floaties when your eyes close too tightly. Went back to work and then about 5 minutes later I saw it again, although this time I heard the bathroom door open and shut, big ass heavy door you pulled open and the mechanism at top of door pulled it shut. Thought maybe one of my coworkers was here for a server fix, so got up and went to greet them and wait for them. About 10 minutes pass and no one comes out of the bathroom. I go in to make sure they're not passed out or hurt. One of my coworkers suffered from seizures, but lo and behold, empty bathroom. Now I'm creeped out. Leave the bathroom and this time see the shadow person thing on the other side of the room dart across again, but looking at it straight on and not from my peripheral vision. Quickly went over and threw the rest of the lights on and started searching the whole office and server room for a coworker, as I was 100% sure they were ducking with me. Never found anyone. Rest of the night was uneventful, as well as the rest of the week, minus me basically shitting bricks sitting at my desk waiting for something else to happen. Something interesting that happened to me not too long ago. I was at work, open cut mining, and I was down the bottom of a fairly deep pit, 200 meters or so. The drive down there is about a kilometer long. The wall from the bottom of the pit to natural surface is called a high wall. My colleague drove down to meet me and said there is someone standing up on the high wall watching us. It seemed unusual as the pit we were in was long abandoned and warranted no visitors. Management liked to poke their head over the walls on occasion to watch operations, but there wasn't much happening in this old one. We were pumping water out that had accumulated over the years. I didn't think much on it but made sure to do everything the right way in case it was management. We had to go back to the surface to make a phone call, and on the way back down I saw a man's silhouette. It was weird though, as he would have had to have been at least 2.5 meters tall or so to be seen from where he stood. I could see him from the waist up. And his head/neck was an arc kinda. No neck to speak of, and the head was bald and went straight to the shoulders. Plus everyone is supposed to wear a hard hat which changes the outline of a figure rather noticeably. My colleague then said, "You see him up there," so we both could see him. The figure then glided out of view to his left and down, so he was no longer visible. The movement was unnatural. We arrived at the bottom and my colleague said we should go for a drive up to that position to see who was there, so we turned around and drove to the area up top. The road there had been long unused. I was studying to dirt road and there was no signs of tire tracks. We pulled up at a small tree that we used as a reference point from down below and had a look around. We had left tire tracks and our own boots left prints, but there was absolutely no other tracks. I stood in the spot the mystery man stood roughly and worked out the angles roughly and realized he must have been the height he was. We ended up getting a call from the boss, so we left and didn't talk much about it afterwards. I was telling my sister about it the following day and she said the night before I saw the figure, she was staying at her work accommodation and a large black figure rushed her from a 45-degree angle from behind. Shook her up a bit and she's fairly unshakable. It vanished once it got to her, but because of the position it came from and the speed, she was unable to say whether it was the same shape as the one I saw. Who knows for sure, but interesting to say the least. One of the most strangest things that ever happened to me I can't figure out, and still can't get my head around when I think about it. One night I was extremely ill. I was struggling with a respiratory virus and high temps, and I dozed off to sleep for a few hours. No dream or any recollection of having a dream at all, but all I could hear in my sleep was a male voice firmly and sternly saying, "Wake up, you need to wake up right now." In my left ear right next to me. The voice sounded exactly like a male companion I knew at the time. I woke up immediately, opened my eyes, and I was frothing at the mouth, sweating, and my body felt as though it just wasn't a part of me. Like something happened to my body in my sleep. I felt as though I possibly seized maybe or lost consciousness. I woke up and just knew I had just almost randomly died in my sleep, and the familiar voice woke me up just in time. It's so hard to even explain. For some reason though, the voice in my ear telling me to wake up was the voice of someone I had gotten close to, but even though the voice sounded identical to this person, I just knew it wasn't him, if that makes sense, just his voice. I was living alone and was the only one in the house when this happened. A few months down the track and I was at his house and we were talking just general conversation, and he randomly out of nowhere calmly just says, "I saved your life," then just carried on about what he was talking about prior. I just sat there gobsmacked. I never told him what happened. He had no knowledge at all. And when he said, "I saved your life," randomly out of the blue, it just felt like it was a whole nother person speaking that phrase, but in his body. It was just so unbelievably strange, and I don't even know what to make of the situation, but it has played on my mind for years and I have always kept it to myself as it just was too bizarre. I'm pretty sure I had a shapeshifter encounter a few summers back. I went to the corner store in the middle of the afternoon to buy beer and noticed several people loitering in front of the store, including a woman pushing a baby stroller. This wasn't atypical, as I live in a city with a sizable homeless population. As I walked up to the door, I happened to look into the stroller and noticed that there was an adult with several physical disabilities sitting in the stroller. The best way I can describe how they looked is sort of like Pepper from American Horror Story, but with dwarf proportions. I remember thinking to myself how dehumanizing it is to push an adult in a baby stroller, and then told myself not to stare at them. After a few seconds of looking at them, I looked up at the woman pushing the stroller, who was staring daggers into me. She had an interesting look. Blonde, late middle-aged, wearing lots of eyeliner. She was pretty but had intense dark/sinister vibes about her. I broke eye contact with her after a second or so, entered the store, and again in my head kept repeating not to look at her or the stroller. I want to emphasize here that this turned into a compulsive type of mantra in my head. It's not that I was scared, I just felt like something was off about these people and I wasn't looking to find out what it was. I go to the beer section, spend maybe 30 seconds trying to decide on a beer, and hear the door open. I keep telling myself not to look, finally grab a beer, and move on to the wine section at the front of the store. I catch a few glimpses of the stroller in my peripheral vision, but I sure as hell wasn't trying to look again. I get to the counter, the cashier rings up the items but can't find a price for the beer. He ends up sending a coworker over to the beer section, where the stroller is now positioned directly in front of. The coworker has a question about which beer or something that apparently requires an answer from me. The cashier motions me to look towards the beer section where the coworker is confirming either the type of beer or price with me. And then I look into the damn stroller. The adult in the stroller is no longer an adult with severe physical disabilities, but a seemingly healthy baby/young toddler. I feel a sinking in the pit of my stomach, pay for the damn beer, and exit the store without looking back again. A few thoughts on the experience: supernatural or a hallucination. Something felt very off from the moment I arrived at that store. I think I'm sensitive to energies, some days more than others, but this felt like my intuition or sixth sense was on red alert. I left the store thinking one of three options could have happened. I saw a legit shapeshifter, I hallucinated a shapeshifter, or the lady was maybe pulling some kind of confidence game and switched the adult out of the stroller with the baby. I also left the store perhaps the most creeped out that I was actively avoiding looking at the stroller and the lady. I would have left the store never seeing a different person in that baby stroller if the beer rang up normally. This last anecdote is probably unrelated and I don't usually include it when I tell this story. That night at like 3 a.m, I woke up to get a glass of water and saw a deer staring at me through my kitchen window while it chewed on some kind of tree or shrub 20 feet away in my neighbor's yard. Shapeshifter or coincidence?